Welcome to Cuba Communist Threat, the Victims of Communist Memorial Foundation series dedicated to helping Americans better understand the nature of the communist Cuba regime and the communist Cuban party and the key issues affecting the US, Latin America, and the global impact from Cuba into the different countries in the world. We know that Cuba has a major impact in Africa, Latin America, now in Italy, exporting Cuban doctors to Italy to help with the COVID-19 pandemic. This event it's a possibility to share some information and having the best expert talking about the Cuba medical missions and other important issues related to Cuba. I'm Carlos Ponce. I'm the director for Latin American programs at BOC, and I'm pleased to present you today a good friend, Jason Poblete. Jason Poblete is not only a lawyer, a really good lawyer, but also he has in his heart the need for fighting against communist regime, the need for fighting against authoritarian. Jason has been involved in the fight against the Nicaraguan regime, the Venezuelan regime. He is representing several groups that have been persecuting in Venezuela and trying to help some political prisoners in Venezuela. And he has been very active in terms of Cuba, the regime in Cuba, and how the regime in Cuba has been violating human rights. The good thing about also Jason is also the head of the Global Liberty Alliance. That is a nonprofit that has been dealing also with the innovative ways to persecute or prosecute the Cuban regime, bringing the case to justice and helping the Cuban people to be more active in terms of the democratic fight. Jason, it's really good to have you here. I'm excited about this opportunity, having this different kind of conversation. We're gonna have a different session today. So it's gonna be more in terms of a Q&A. I'm gonna ask you some questions. And I want to, for everybody who's watching us today, you have the opportunity to send questions to Jason, and I will ask those questions to Jason. So Jason, first, Cuba is communist, or Cuba just is a nice regime supporting medical missions around the world. And also, according to Coping, the Cuban regime needs to receive the Nobel Prize because of the Cuban medical missions, because how the compromise from the Cuban regime with the humanitarian causes and how to support the world. What do you think about the Cuban regime? Let's begin with the Cuban regime and your own expertise.
How much time do we have? So we can chat for a while, but first of all, Carlos and Victims of Communism, thank you for hosting these programs. It's needed. It's part of educating our colleagues around the world over about the struggle against communism that's still very much with us. In our case, just 90 miles from our shores. And Carlos, thank you for your work and the work your team is doing, because without this platform, we will not be able to educate, which is part of this process. And it's a very difficult topic, frankly, sobering topic we're chatting about today. Frankly, I never thought I'd be in 2020 having a conversation about a topic that we've known about since the 1980s and 1990s and 1960s, like the Cuban medical brigades, for example. So Cuba is a communist country, as is China, as is North Korea. It's a totalitarian police state. I refer to it as a regime, not a government, and that's a very important distinction. And it's one that I hope that your viewers will take time to learn about, because it's one that requires a sustained focus, especially on this important topic that we're going to chat about today, which involves trafficking in persons. And if they're going to, interestingly, nominating someone for the Nobel Peace Prize for these brigades makes about as much sense as a trap door in a canoe. That would basically be saying it's okay to be in the slave trade. It's okay to engage in trafficking in your fellow man. And, I want to recommend to your folks, before we jump into Cuba, those interested in learning more about trafficking, there's a good book by Kurt Hauser. It's put out by the Hoover Institute. And it's a book about modern day slavery. And it's a good place to kind of educate yourself to begin and jump off to learn about this modern day problem that right here in the Western Hemisphere, trafficking in medical professionals by Cuba, along with sex trafficking and child trafficking, labor trafficking, is generating billions of dollars a year in revenue that is not being realized, not being earned. It's being taken away from these people and going, in the case of Cuba, into the coffers of the Communist Party.
No, it is one thing about the Cuba fake. Because, well, it is fake. Is that they are supposed to be doctors sent into these countries, and not all of them are doctors. Some of them are spy. Not all of them are prepared to deal with this kind of coronavirus or other things. We learn from doctors that has been sending to different countries that they have to fake the reports, they have to mess with the governments, they have to do some kind of things. What do you think about this kind of program, and how this program has been affecting other countries? Mexico, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Bolivia. I know that you have been active in terms of Brazil, Ecuador, and other countries. How this program works and why we have to care about that?
Well, let's go back a little bit to when it began. We can't go over all of it, but it's important to understand the context of what these programs are and what they are not. Imagine if you're about to go off to medical school or nursing school, you want to be a dentist, and you have a vocation to heal. In a free country, you go through school, you learn, you pick your institution, you compete, you're admitted. In places like Cuba, and Cuba especially since the 1960s, the only people who get to go to medical school are the vanguard of the Communist Party, basically. People who've been cultivated, handpicked. In fact, if you talk to Cuban medical professionals who've left, someone will tell you, we were brainwashed. We really didn't know what we were getting ourselves into. And you're programmed. So it's ideological, but it's also exploiting someone at their most vulnerable point, at their youth, when they want to go out and serve, to then be put into a system that expects you to comply, a collective, if you will. So in Cuba, everybody knows this if you studied it, there's these things called the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution. And these are people who live in your blocks, who keep an eye on you from the moment you're born to see if you are the type of person that's an ideal socialist on the way to communism, or if you're someone who has to be removed from Cuban society. Now, people like me, who were born here of Cuban parents, for example, they used to call my relatives worms and gusanos, and people who were not ideologically correct, people who believed in free markets, people who believed in fundamental rights, individual rights. Those type of people are removed from Cuban society. So if you're a Cuban professional and you're picked to go to those medical schools, or they brainwash you, or you're forced to go into these medical schools, you then have to make a choice. You either comply or you leave. Now, in the case of these missions that go back to 1960, the first one, by the way, was a small one that was deployed into Chile in response to an earthquake. The first big one was in 1963. It was sent to Algeria with the support of the Soviet Union. And by the way, Cuba is still a client state of Russia, so they have a big hand to play in this also, which we'll talk about later. But these missions were sent out there, yes, to heal, but they also spy. And they also were used to manipulate and create propaganda and create the grand universal healthcare system that these folks envision. That hasn't changed any from the Cold War. It continues in different degrees, of course, and now it's a little more economic than ideological, but it's both ideological and economic. Put yourself in the shoes of the young doctor, the young nurse, the dentist, the physical therapist who wants to do well. When they finally leave Cuba and they take away their passport, and they can't have a boyfriend or a girlfriend, or they cannot earn their own money, because 60 to 90% of what they own goes to the Communist Party of Cuba. How do you think that makes them feel? So there's a reawakening. These people, when they're in freedom, you can't smother freedom. That's why Cuba has been so successful. They're a gulag island, and they've been able to control it, and they still control it. But when these young men and women get a taste of freedom, and they see what it's like, even when they have someone from the Communist Party with them at all times, taking notes, just like they did back in Cuba when they were growing up in their neighborhood, they realize that there's something wrong about this. And hey, if they signed the contract, which by the way, is very interesting, Carlos, and this is the way they do this. Everything is according to the law. You sign a contract. a contract, by the way, that you don't keep. So the Cuban doctor or nurse signs a contract, then they take it away from you. They take away your passport, like I mentioned to you. And then the Cuban government negotiates these deals with foreign governments. And the foreign governments then agree to pay for these people. They cut out the worker. That's a violation of fundamental rights. It's a violation of worker rights. And frankly, we need to have a serious conversation. And we have to be grateful that the US government has started to reorient the way we approach this issue, because trafficking has been a long time issue for the US, anti-trafficking. We are leaders in that. And right here in the Western Hemisphere, we can start with this one. So Canada, Mexico, and our other partners, think about that next time you invite a Cuban doctor. Why are you condoning the trafficking in these people? We have to have that conversation.
We have one question. I'm gonna take some question and continue with my Q&A. But this is interesting. So you mentioned the word remove from Cuban society. That means jail, kill. What happened with these people that the regime removed from society?
Well, the people who are, if you are considered to be someone who is not compatible with the Long March, which by the way, it's in their new constitution. They didn't remove it. It's in there. They acknowledge we're a socialist country moving toward communism. If you do not fit their mold of the ideal person, you are now suddenly, well, back in the 60s, it was a lot more violent. Today, it's a little more subtle, but you could end up, look what happened to people like Jose Daniel Ferrer. Look what's happening to people like, Dr. Oscar Elias Bisset, a US Presidential Medal of Honor recipient. President Bush gave him that medal while he was in Cuba in jail. He could not go receive, he's a doctor, by the way. He resisted, and look what happened to him. They locked him up. So what happens to you in Cuba, that if you don't conform, you're jailed, you're psychologically tortured, you're asked to leave, or you're moved out by force, or they kill you, as in the case of Oswaldo Paya, who I believe he was killed. So, and this happens to these doctors, by the way, or these nurses. They use that sort of coercion that's been ingrained in them from youth to keep control on them, on their salaries, on their families back in Cuba. Imagine being told, if you go out on a medical mission and you're told that if you do not do what we're asking you to do, for example, a dental cleaning in a remote area of Venezuela, that at the same time you have to tell them, hey, Maduro's a good guy, vote for him or vote for Chavez. If you don't do that for us, we're going to do something to your family back in Cuba. How would that make you feel? It would make you feel horrible. So it is a careful balancing act. You're right, Carlos. There are spies within these groups, but we have to really disassemble this process. And I do think we have the laws and the policy to make that happen.
Talking about the laws, about the policies and the engagement from the U.S., as a person who has been engaged with Cuba for 30 years, and I was in an organization, I was responsible probably of a huge number of the programs that the U.S. government managed at that time in Cuba. And at that time, I don't want to talk about the administration at that time, they never asked me any question about opening the relationship with Cuba. They never asked about advice, how to operate. They just opened, and of course, that didn't work. But there is a change. There has been a change exposing the Cuban regime, that there are other tools there. What about using the U.S. Democracy Act against this medical mission and the countries and the people that have been supporting actively this human trafficking and this major violation of human rights and against all the democratic principle? U.S. Democratic Act, how we can use that?
Well, I think the Democracy Act is one of the gateway, the early statutes. It was passed in 1992, also known as the Torricelli Bill. And there's also the Cuban Democracy, the Cuban Liberty and Democratic Solidarity Act. There's several that we could turn to. And the Cuban Democracy Act in particular, I'm glad you raised this, Carlos. There are certain sections in there. For example, it's not just about tracking down the people who are trafficking in the Cuban doctors. And we, by the way, intend to do that along with some other organizations, and we have been doing that. But it also involves diplomacy. It involves reminding our allies that if you owe the US money, we can waive debt. There's waivers of debt payments. Guess what? We could turn that off under the Cuban Democracy Act if you insist on cooperating with the Cuban government in trafficking and other human rights violations, and even more so to our NATO partners. to anybody who purchases arms pursuant to the Arms Export Control Act. It's in the Cuban Democracy Act. We can condition the cooperation by tying it to arms exports. So they're broad authorities, and we have many, many other things we can do. Let's use briefly the Trade Sanctions Reform Act, which allows the export of food and medicine to Cuba. Well, there's an argument to be made. If you're a European company selling medical devices to Cuba, in my private practice, I would probably say to these people, you know, you may want to check if this equipment is being diverted for use on these medical missions, because you may find yourself in a very difficult predicament that you're supplying tools that are being used in an enterprise, a criminal enterprise, which we can talk about that in a minute. There's a good lawsuit down in Florida that we can talk about. That is, so you're basically engaging in indirect support of trafficking in persons by giving medical equipment, medicines that we need to make. And by the way, that exists to this day. We have to account for everything exported to Cuba. We should check and ask our partners, Canada, Mexico, anyone in Europe, if we're going to be partners in trade, for example, with Canada and Mexico, let's be partners in human rights, and let's put an end to Cuban trafficking by saying no to trafficking in doctors.
It's like they are partners in crime. France continues supporting the work of the Cuba medical program in Haiti, same than Canada. Even there was a mission from some Canada's indigenous group going to Cuba and trying to bring the doctors to Canada. What looks funny, but it's the reality. This is a way for the regime to survive, sending these doctors abroad to get cash. Every doctor received only $500, $600, maximum $1,000, and the regime charge $10,000. But I bring that into because you mentioned the lawsuit in Florida, and that deals with PAHO, that also charge some percentage of the work of these Cuban doctors in Brazil. So what is the work of World Health Organization, PAHO at the OAS level? They have been contributing with this program, even though it's a program they abuse.
I'm glad you raised that one too, Carlos. You know, in light of what's happening right now with the China flu and their negligence, at least in informing the free world about what was happening in China late in 2019 and their apparent manipulation of the World Health Organization, I wasn't surprised by any of that, because that's exactly what Cuba has been doing to the Pan American Health Organization and the UN, which in my opinion, they're broken systems that have to be reformed. And by the way, kudos to Secretary General of the OAS, Almagro, for trying to bring some of that reform to the inter-American system, because we need some type of change, and it begins with us, and it begins here. The Pan American Health Organization, in essence, in that lawsuit, which is an amazing lawsuit, and I encourage folks to read it, read the complaint, the amended complaint, in the Southern District of Florida, several brave former doctors on these medical missions have lent their names to a class action to begin to show how the Pan American Health Organization may have been serving as a broker, basically trying to facilitate these contracts between governments in the Western Hemisphere, in this case, Brazil, and under a prior administration by someone who was an acolyte of the Foro Sao Paulo and a very crooked inter-American system that we can talk about later in Q&A. And these people were basically allegedly brokering these deals where they were keeping a percent, they were skimming some off the top, millions of dollars in an inter-American NGO. You should not have been doing that. If the facts in that case pan out and that case goes to trial, it's going to be a major scandal that Congress is going to have to investigate. To me, it's no surprise though, because those of us that have been following this issue for decades have seen the broken international system and how the leftist governments the world over, Russia, China, manipulate it to undermine US national interest. And it happens right here in the Western Hemisphere on a daily basis.
More about the US national interest and or business sector. There is a major concern about the exception of the embargo and how these medical missions operate in the rest of the region, and how maybe using a U.S. health system and U.S. companies and probably supporting Cuba, and Cuba is using that in other countries. That's the first question that I have to you. Do we have to care about that? And the second one is with respect also U.S. companies and Mexico. Mexico probably is violating the agreement by bringing 500 Cuban doctors to Mexico. They don't need, they have enough doctors, but because of ideological approaches to the regime in Cuba, they're bringing 500 doctors to Mexico, or spies to Mexico. Both situations, do we have to care? Or private sector, do we need to care?
Well, I think we're seeing what's happening in China, why we have to care. We pretended nothing was happening in China for decades, pretending China was our friend. And we are, of course, the champions of liberty, supporters of the victims of communism, know that's not the case. Yes, we have to care. Cuba is a client state of Russia. We haven't talked a lot about Russia, but from a security standpoint, yes, it's a problem. From an American first policy perspective, we are a leader in trafficking, combating trafficking in persons. So yes, we need to focus on Cuba and start breaking that stranglehold, because if we don't, they will continue to take advantage of it. And in the type of world that we live in today, we're supposed to be thinking a little broader and not just, we thought China was going to come around if we threw all this money at it. It's never. Communists don't change that way. They just adapt. They take what they want. And it's almost a leech out of the system. That's what Cuba does. So opening up to trade in Cuba is a fallacy. That's not the way this is going to happen. We have a roadmap of engagement. It's been in place since 1996. It's very clear. One of the bigger mistakes we made when we reopened the embassy in Cuba was not engaging from a U.S. position of U.S. interests first. We didn't talk about trafficking. We said it was all right. We didn't talk about property claims. We said it was all right. We didn't prioritize our interests first. We tried to put the other perspective ahead of that, the international perspective. And that's a broken way to do things. We need to change that. I'm glad it's changing. And on Cuba, on medical trafficking, it starts with a very rich arsenal of laws. It's not just sanctions. Sanctions are a tool. So there's a fallacy here that sanctions are causing the suffering in Cuba. That's malarkey. That's Fidel. Raul and his people know that's malarkey. This is not about the embargo or about sanctions. It's about a crooked, corrupt, criminal enterprise in Havana that's doing the bidding of Mother Russia and doing problems for America wherever it can. And same thing, by the way, for China. China manipulates its relationship with Cuba. The problem, interesting, Carlos, because we haven't talked about Venezuela yet, but briefly, I've always said that the road to liberty in Caracas begins in Havana. Mm-hmm. And by extension, it begins with Moscow. We need to deal with the Russia problem, the China problem, and of course, they're all complicit in trafficking. But out here, those of us in the private sector who believe in free markets, who believe in labor rights, we need to stand up and do what we can by telling the Cubans no more of this. And if you want to buy US goods and US medical devices and medical products, and to our European friends who wrap themselves constantly in this mantle of human rights, but turn around and do completely different things. And I've seen that firsthand, by the way. For example, look at our Iran policy, where we helped bring home Americans held hostage, and the Europeans were constantly undermining the release of Americans and others held hostages because they were worried about preserving the JCPOA. Same thing happens here in the Western Hemisphere. We need our partners in the region, Mexico, Canada, work with us. Canada, stop worrying so much about your hotels, for Pete's sake. You're going to make a lot of money one day when Cuba opens up again, when it's free, when free people can interact in markets without government interference. Liberty will flourish, prosperity will flourish, and these horrible modern day slavery scourges will be eliminated. But we have to start by talking frankly and being upfront about it. And it's going to be an uncomfortable conversation at the beginning, but it's a reality, it's happening, and we're going to keep talking about it.
Yeah, let's continue exposing. One of the beauty of the engagement from USA, the Department of State, and some organizations like yours is exposing the regime, exposing this program. This program, as you mentioned, has been in place for 50-something years, providing almost half of the income for the Cuban regime. They maintain the whole operation thanks to this program. And they have been forced to admit that the program is there, that they overcharge for each doctor, and they say that it's to invest that on island. What do you think about that? This response from the regime when the U.S. Community has been exposing this program?
If we're going to, they're not a very transparent system, as most communist systems tend to be. So it's difficult to know how much they're generating from it. But if we're going to believe some of the statistics that we've seen, that's their #1 generator of money. It's in the $6 to $8 billion range, all done on the backs of human beings, fellow human beings. This should sober everyone. And they don't care, by the way. Why don't they care? Because they're focused on the collective. Remember what we talked about. The moment they think you're not part of building a communist paradise on earth, they begin to make life impossible for you. So you must conform. You must be part of that system. Resistance is futile. For those of you who, and they will push you out. There's no way around it. And it's billions of dollars a year worth to them. By the way, the second largest revenue generator for them is remittances. And then comes a few other different categories. Carlos, I want you to guess, what do you think is Cuba's leading provider of medicine? So the average Cuban, do you think they get their medicine from the state, or where do you think they get it from? It's a rhetorical question. You know the answer to that.
Oh, yeah.
It's their pharmacies. They can't even take care of their own people because they don't have pharmacies well stocked. So you have to buy aspirin in the United States to export to Cuba. So this medical mission business, it's causing trouble back home because people in Cuba need health. People, the Cuban healthcare miracle, by the way, is one of the biggest hoaxes around, and someday it will be exposed. And part of that process to exposing it and holding people to account is what you're talking about it, getting these programs reoriented to do something that actually is going to be worth something, not only to a future free Cuba, but it's going to help Americans project into the region consistent with U.S. policy, consistent with U.S. values of we don't believe that government should be allowed with impunity to traffic in other people. So I think this is a positive development the last few years. We hope it continues. And at least for our group and other groups like ours, we're going to continue exposing and holding to account everyone involved in this trade.
There are some groups that contribute with Cuban medical missions, probably that deals also U.S. groups that also deals with exchanging information, exchanging also medical and health collaboration. There's one organization that operates in Miami that engage in, I cannot mention the name, but they engage in collaboration and also distribute information about the need for supporting the health care system in Cuba and bringing more attention. There's also a group of people in Miami. Maybe you have some data about the people in Miami, in Washington, and other places involved in supporting the regime. There's any data about these people that support the regime? What is the role of these people that are here in the U.S. that are selling the propaganda about the regime, promoting the regime, and supporting the regime from the U.S.?
Yeah. I'm glad you asked that question also, because there are organizations, unfortunately, even American universities around the country who've held exchange programs for years with the Cuban healthcare system. It's almost a smaller version of the Confucian Institutes for communist China. Why American academic institutions or NGOs would allow themselves to be manipulated in that way makes no sense to me. And by the way, we will expose all of that as well. Anyone who is trying to prop up or create misinformation about what the Cuban healthcare system is or is not, that is not the appropriate way to use U.S. taxpayer monies, if you're using U.S. taxpayer monies for that sort of thing, or to enjoy a nonprofit tax status either, to be serving, in essence, as an indirect arm for the Cuban government and spreading misinformation of a system that's broken. There is no miracle. Again, it's a hoax. And more importantly, that traffics in your fellow human being. And by the way, it's interesting about this trafficking and the entering and exit of Cuban doctors from the United States, those that do not abandon the system, but who stay in it. That's a national security risk. There are spies embedded in that program. And that's why Cuban medical professionals are screened at a heightened level when they apply for political asylum. And I believe the program should remain frozen until those screenings are completely in place, because the Cuban government, because Russia wants it, because China needs it, uses that program and other programs like it to penetrate US society. That's not saying that all Cuban doctors who defect are spies. No, that's not what I'm saying. Quite the opposite. It's a very risky step to defect. However, from a security standpoint, we do have to be vigilant, because they will use that program to penetrate and undermine the United States from within.
What about the citizens that goes to Cuba? Because Cuba has this amazing healthcare system according to the Cuban regime, and goes there for treatment. People go for Cuba for treatment. There are some Latin American countries sending their students to training in Cuba to improve the capabilities as doctor of study medicine in Cuba. What do you think about that? Cuba as a place for healthcare, medical support to other countries and training their doctors, and also to go there for treatment.
Anybody traveling to Cuba for healthcare is participating in Cuba healthcare apartheid. It's trying to get access to healthcare that the Cuban people don't even have, assuming that what they're even receiving is safe, because it probably is not. And also because they're paying for it, which Cubans do not. So you travel at your own risk. You probably should not be doing that. And frankly, any American who travels to Cuba for healthcare should really think twice about doing something like that. We have plenty of stories that we can share with you from great organizations that are out there who've been documenting this thing, like Cuba Archives and many others, about problems within the Cuban healthcare system that, again, it's not a miracle, it's a hoax. But more importantly than that, it's an apartheid system. There's two-tiered systems in Cuba. There's one for the Cuban people, and there's one for the tourists who pay cash. They devalue human life. That is what the communist system does. They look at it from they don't look at markets as a way to create independence and wealth. They look at markets and wealth as a way to keep the Communist Party elites in power. The very small cadre of people at the very top. You know, this is no longer about Castro, my friends. This is about now a transition into a corrupt narco-terrorist state, or potentially a free state. And participating in medical apartheid, you are participating in helping keeping the Communist Party in power in Cuba. Go to Puerto Rico if you want to get better health care. There's plenty of places here in the US where you can get great health care. Avoid Cuba if you can.
Well, it depends. We can create a place for magical cure to all the disease and all the health problems, and send people like Chavez had a good treatment, and thanks to Cuba, the world got rid of this autocrat. Maybe we have to send all the autocrats to Cuba. But going to Venezuela, let's just try to focus now. Cuba, Venezuela, that really strong relationship. The export of Cuban doctors to Venezuela, the export of Cuban experts in terms of torture, in terms of persecution, they created the system that is in Venezuela and that has been in place for the last 20 years. What do you have to say about that relationship, or the triangle, Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua? How do you see that operating?
Yeah, briefly for your viewers, in Venezuela was pretty much the supplier or the genesis of the oil for doctor program. So Hugo Chavez and the Communist Party of Cuba many years ago put in place an exchange program where they would send medical professionals to Cuba, and in exchange for that, Venezuela would send their oil to Cuba. And in exchange, I mean, this is depending on the data, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of people potentially. And these folks were deployed all over Venezuela, and they proselytized the gospel according to Karl Marx and Fidel Castro and other fellow travelers. And it was not just about medical care. This was about being out there and advancing the socialist cause. And for American citizens, by the way, it may seem like a very far away problem, but there are Americans, for example, who are unlawfully imprisoned in Venezuela. I represent one of them, Mr. Tomeo Vidal from Louisiana. And I would not be surprised in the least if Mr. Vidal, who should be home with his family in Louisiana, was tortured by men and women who run the prison system and the intelligence services of Venezuela. So the Venezuela issue is not some faraway problem. It's a very problem close to home. It hits very close to many, many people. So the Cuban medical missions, again, with its client sponsor, Russia, let's not leave Russia out of this, is a big part of the problem right now in Venezuela and in Nicaragua as well. And Nicaragua's medical missions are not as big, but the exchanges happen. Cuban intelligence officers run several ministries or support technically several ministries. And there are doctors in Cuba, in Nicaragua, that have been welcomed with open arms by the Ortega Murillo regime, who again is part of that triangle of tyranny outlined by the administration a few years ago. So it's an issue that we have to deal with, and the medical missions, I believe, are a huge problem in Venezuela right now.
Oh, you are right about the Russia influence in Cuba. They're still having, but of course, Cuba took advantage from the Soviet Union for many years, and the Russian doesn't want to maintain the regime anymore. So that's why Venezuela, but Russia also has been intervening in Venezuela, and Russia has a strong presence, selling weapons, giving away weapons, have some buildings in place in Nicaragua. And also China. So China gave $6-7 million to Cuba, thanks to to thank Cuba for the engagement with the rest of the region, collaborating for open business for Cuba in Latin America. So what is that strange relationship between Cuba or among Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Russia, and China?
Well, I think they're united by one key thing: animus against the United States. They are here not as friends. The Belt Road Initiative is not something we want in the Western Hemisphere. And every leader in the Western Hemisphere who signs up for this needs to be reminded that this is liberty's hemisphere, and we're here to work together to push these type of influences out of the Americas. They're here to destabilize. They're not here to be a friendly people. And by the way, I have no problem with the people of China. This is with the Communist Party of China. And same thing with Putin's Russia. Putin, in my book, is here to cause problems. He's not here to be a friend. Putin is no friend of the United States. And he uses Cuba, he uses Venezuela, he uses Nicaragua to undermine US national and security interests. And they view it as their plaything. And we have to be very clear that that's not the type of behavior we're going to tolerate. That's changing. We're seeing a good wave in places like Bolivia. We're seeing some interesting developments in Ecuador. There are some developments in other regions of even the Caribbean even. But we need to do better, because the Chinese and the Russians, again, they view this as a way to check US power. And of course, they encourage Cuba to do things like the medical missions because it helps them. Remember, medical missions include spies. Spies collect information. Cuba sells that information. It's part of the system, anti-American, propping up a globalist system that we have seen, because of China flu, failed, and we have to work even harder to stop it.
What needs to be the U.S. approach to this? More funding, more engagement in terms of sanctions, more policy use in the legislation? Because what I see right now is that thanks to the COVID-19, to the coronavirus, the Cuban regime took the doctors from Brazil, from Ecuador, from Bolivia, and now you have 500 doctors in Mexico. They sending doctors to Guyana. They sending more doctors to Haiti. They send doctors to Argentina, South Africa, also to Italy. They have been spreading their doctors, so probably the income for the regime, it's the same. So what needs to be the U.S. policy right now? More engagement, more investment, applying the law. What do you think there needs to be the engagement of the administration?
Three things, and we're doing one of them today. So it's disclosure, diplomacy, and we have to focus on holding those powers to account. Part of it is disclosure, talking about it, and the Trump administration has done a good job of starting to finally having a U.S. government talk frankly about these things, and that's very important. Diplomacy, that's pretty simple in my book. Every single U.S. ambassador, no matter where they are, whether they're the Western Hemisphere or not, needs to find out if there are Cuban medical doctors in that country, and those ambassadors need to come up with a strategy that is quite simple. You have to choose. You're either going to traffic in people or you're not going to traffic in people. and there's going to be consequences or benefits from doing that. And third, holding the perpetrators to account. That means not just in the Cuban government or inside the governments of other countries who hire these folks, but the private sector and any actor who knowingly engages in that sort of behavior needs to know that there are laws in the books and that there are actors out there right now that didn't exist maybe 10 years ago, but we have them now, like that lawsuit down in Florida shows, which I think there'll be more lawsuits like those. I think if you focus on those three sectors and those three areas and you move day by day, it's not very exciting work, but it can work. We have the political will from an administration willing to do it. Just take a look at President Trump's National Security Directive back from 2017, and you take that along with the laws we have on the book already, and you could start making a dent in this, Carlos. You really can.
And what do you think? This is a question that we have from our Q&A from Danielle. What do you think the U.S. can do to stop Cuba's intelligence apparatus from continuing to help Maduro and multiple regimes, as well as the Cuban regime itself?
Well, I have high confidence in our services that they police Cuba, and our counterintelligence service, they police Cuba. And I think that process has been underway for quite some time. No one in the United States has ever underestimated the threat posed by Russia, state-sponsored Cuba, and Venezuela and other places. And that's a process that I believe has been manifesting itself, although maybe you don't see it in the headlines, but it's happening and it will continue to happen with this administration.
Yeah, this other question, you mentioned something about this that is very specific. It's about not only about the medical missions, but also overall the U.S. support, some of people in the U.S. support to the Cuba regime, and also how we have been allowing for people to travel freely to Cuba, some of the exchange from the chambers of commerce, some of the governors traveling to Cuba, some universities traveling to Cuba, churches doing some work there with the regime, farmers, students, Farm Bureau, U.S. Little League, and this seems to be supported the Cuba dictatorship with this kind of programs. It is strengthening the dictatorship. What can we do to stop this? There needs to be a different role of the U.S. Cuban embassy. So why the Cuban embassy here in the U.S. is so active? So what's going on? And also the exchange programs from the college and the schools. You mentioned something about that.
Yeah, I believe that travel to Cuba should be consistent with U.S. law. And that means that a lot of the programs that we've had in place for more than 15 years need to be reassessed, especially in light of the attacks on U.S. diplomats in Havana, that multiple American citizens were injured by a series of they say, sonic attacks. Who knows exactly what that was, but until that, there's an accounting for that, or because they're holding Americans prisoners down there. There's the case of Anina Lopez, who's been held hostage, in my opinion, for several years. And also anything that's not consistent with the law, basically. But we have to take a U.S. interest first approach, which means focus on these security issues, focus on what's going on there with Russia, Iran, and China, apply U.S. law, which means all this travel that's been allowed over the years by Republican and Democratic administrations, by the way. It has not just been Democratic administrations, both. Travel is to Cuba what oil is to Iran, money. And if we want to have an intelligent relationship or conversation with the island, I mean, we have to be able and willing to put the pressure. I believe U.S. sanctions have never been, U.S. policy, forget sanctions, U.S. policy has never been fully enforced the way it's outlined in the law. If we did, and we started to now, I think we continue doing that, cut travel, cut remittances, you can have a constructive conversation that doesn't put the cart before the horse, that will lead to positive outcomes consistent with U.S. law and policy and values, by the way.
Yeah, maybe that is a good time for this. And we have a general question here from Christian that is about the Cuban structure. We had Fidel, who controlled everything, who had the mind behind the whole structure of the apparatus, or behind the Phoenician approach from Cuba. Then Raúl is not as smart as Fidel, but he can control. And Raúl is behind, and then you have the puppet of Diaz-Canel. What's going to happen in Cuba? This is more general. What's going to happen in Cuba? What there's any potential dark horse there, or any possibility of succession that's having some reform minded, or we need a total change from that regime?
At the rate we're going, I think you're seeing Cuba entering into a phase of high instability potentially. They think they're going to be able to contain it. I do not think they will. There's some folks who believe it'll be a dynastic sort of succession of power. There are others who believe it could break the other way into a series of oligarchies and oligarchic influences. I think we really do not know how it's going to manifest itself. But I believe that the more important question we need here is, if we focus on US policy and we look at the law we have in place of a peaceful transition, and there are ways to give the Cuban people the tools they need. They want to fight. This is not about us telling the Cuban people what to do. They want to fight for their future. There's a lot of people over there who are daily trying to carve out a space to do what we all think they're going to do. They deserve our support. They've asked for it. We don't have to engage with a totalitarian police state 90 miles from our shores. It's just an island of 10 million people. They don't have anything beyond. It's not China. We have a different relationship with Cuba, a special one that can become special again. But it's definitely not going to happen with the people who are at the very top right now, because they do not like dealing with open societies, and they are going to devolve into a certain kind of, we saw this after the fall of the Berlin Wall at the end of the Cold War, where you had these different power centers go into the private sector. And we have a shot at eliminating high levels of corruption or minimizing it and giving the Cuban people tools they need to deal with a democratic and open society, but we're not going to do it piecemeal fashion. I believe we have to focus on applying the law as Congress intended back in the 1990s. There may be some tweaking we have to do, updating a few things, but the president, the Congress have plenty of authorities to support the people who want to help. I think we have an obligation to do it.
Well, back again to the medical missions, and there were a group of Colombian also putting pressure to the Colombian government to allow the medical mission, the Cuban medical mission, to enter to Colombia and support Colombia in the fight against the coronavirus. And they have been putting pressure. Some mayors in Colombia have been putting pressure. What is the influence from Cuba in Colombia? Do you think that Colombia is a major risk? Well, it has been a major risk over all this year with the support from the Cuban regime to the guerrillas. But also there's more threats in Colombia right now since Cuba engagement.
I'm very concerned about Colombia generally, especially with what's happening in the Andean region. I mean, U.S. taxpayers, Carlos, as you know, have invested billions in Colombia over many decades now. And Cuba is a problem. In fact, they were a problem. That's why I was not a big supporter, and still am not a supporter of what they call the so-called peace deal with the FARC terrorist group, where they are trying to whitewash war crimes, all sorts of gross violation of fundamental rights. Cuba tried to portray itself as a peacemaker, but all they were doing was trying to whitewash themselves to come off the state sponsors of terrorism list here in the United States. So I am very concerned about Colombia, especially as it relates to what's happening with Venezuela and what Russia and other powers have in mind for the Andean region. We're not going to have time to go over all of it, but Cuba continues to be an irritant in Colombia. They were empowered by that peace deal. And again, because of it, and because of all the other issues we talked about, including medical missions in Mexico and other countries in the region, we must redouble efforts to crack down on the trafficking, to find the corruption networks, apply the sanctions, and drive the policy that way, and make sure that we follow our own laws when we expose these things, and hold these people to account. I believe we do that, and people and allies in Colombia will have the courage to stand up to the Cubans, and maybe won't be as prone to wanting to welcome these fellow travelers back into the region again.
Good, good. Now, let's back to prosecution and persecuting this nasty regime and how that we can stop the human trafficking. Can we bring cases in other countries in terms of malpractice? Because some of these people, some of them are really good doctors, but there are some spies without the enough training to deal with some specific health issues in some countries. So malpractice or cases from the doctors that decided to stay in those countries, because some countries like Brazil offer to pay directly to the doctors and not to the regime for them to stay in those countries. So what we can do internally, can we use the legislation from those countries, the court system from those countries to engage in persecuting this terrible practice of sending these poor doctors to these countries, and the cases about malpractice from some of the spies that pretend to be doctors?
Yeah, you can do that at multiple levels. And the Global Liberty Alliance worked with a team of lawyers in Brazil with a group of doctors that the case evidence was given to the Attorney General of Brazil, documenting some of these human rights abuses using Brazilian law to hold the Brazilian system to account. And there are many ways under different legal systems in the hemisphere that we are exploring to bring those type of cases. And we encourage, by the way, any Cuban medical professionals who may be listening to this to step up and get in contact with us, because you do have options. There are a lot of friends in the hemisphere who want to help. And there are many different mechanisms in the national courts and also some international tribunals where you can expose this injustice and hold these people to account. And we also are being given information, by the way, Carlos, by people within Cuba, within the Cuban bureaucracy, who are sharing information with us about these sort of programs. So I guess here you would call them whistleblowers. And these are people who are putting their lives at risk by sharing what we believe are very sensitive records that we can use to form the basis of maybe global Magnitsky sanctioning of individuals who we can prove were involved in this sort of illicit behavior. So there's many potential options that can be pursued in open societies and countries that have rule of law, that have court systems. So even here in the United States, even though it's difficult, there's the Alien Tort Statute, there's the anti-trafficking provisions. So if you happen to be a Cuban doctor who's here and has political asylum, there's many different things that could be done throughout the Americas and in other countries to hold these traffickers to account, and we intend to do it.
And then there's also a question here that's related to this, because we need also to continue the engagement of U.S. diplomats in all this country to support all this process and to open the eye of some of this government that they cannot allow these doctors from operating in those countries. It's creating a major problem, and this is against the U.S. Democrat and the worldwide human rights. But what about the Castro regimes? The Cuban regime has been accusing U.S. Of terrorists against Cuban diplomats, but nobody mentioned how these Cubans diplomats has been targeting U.S. diplomats and has been targeting the international arena to impose their agenda. What do you think about that? How do you think about this Cuba interaction at the global level?
At the diplomatic level?
Oh, yes.
I mean, I think that's a prime space that we should be energetically leaning into, and all our ambassadors around the world where there are medical missions. I would publish a list. The US government maybe should publish a list in their trafficking in persons report. I think before the next report's issued, every medical mission should be exposed. It should be listed on the website at the State Department. And every ambassador in these countries should have a US policy right in front of them on how to handle and how to encourage these countries not to contract with these doctors, which is modern day slavery, with the terms set by the Cuban government. Encourage them to do it another way. And if they don't, there can be repercussions for doing that. So, you know, during the Cold War, we may not have had all these different tools, but we have them today. And there's been a reorientation of our policy right now. I encourage everyone to look at President Trump's national security directive on the Western Hemisphere, on Cuba. Every US diplomat should be armed with that and have a special set of talking points on how to deal with the diplomat issue, with the Cuban doctor issue.
Yeah, what about the International Labor Organization? Do we need to forget about them, or do we need to bring cases there? Because this is forced labor too.
Yeah, I do think it's a place, it's a forum, a forum where we should bring cases, being mindful that the international system moves very slow, but we should, if we have the good case, document it and put it in the system. Here, for example, in the Inter-American system, it can move a little faster. We have a lot of pending petitions that just sit there and are not moved fast enough. But if you move at all these different levels with diplomacy, with this international litigation that you're talking about, with sanctions, with travel restrictions, with cooperation, it can get momentum. And I believe it will have an impact. It's just Cuba. It's just an island of 10 million people. The program is not as big as they make it out to be. And I believe that if you publish the information about this program and remind countries that allow this sort of transaction to happen, that they're engaging in human trafficking, I think you're going to see changes in how Cuba outsources its medical personnel.
What I love about these events is that for sure the Cuban regime is watching. And anytime that we expose them, it is magical. Anytime that we have the opportunity to expose the regime. We only have 3 more minutes, and I want to just thank everyone for their engagement, their questions, really good questions. I want to invite everyone for next week. We're going to have Rosa Maria Payá, and we will have an expert. Today, with Jason, it's amazing the different areas that we can use and to persecute the regime, to prosecute the regime. So Jason, you have 2 more minutes. So in these 2 more minutes is all of you and sending the last message for our audience and for the ones that are gonna watch this on YouTube after after today.
Well, thank you, Carlos, and thank you to the victims of communism once again for sponsoring this program and this series of programs designed to raise awareness about the communist threat in the hemisphere and everywhere in the world where it exists, and it still exists. Let's remember, China's a communist country, Cuba's a communist country, or wants to be a communist country, and I believe that by informing fellow Americans about the threats posed by these systems, these un-American systems, we start to combat them. Second, to any Cuban medical professional who feels they've been trafficked in. And I know there's a lot of you out there. I know some of you are very, very scared, but there's a lot of folks who want to help. We encourage you to step forward. We have secure ways of connecting with us, and we hope you will do it. And finally, to our friends here in the United States, inform yourselves. Again, get a copy of Hauser's book from the Hoover Institution. It's a great read about trafficking in persons. It'll start giving you an idea about how pervasive this problem is, why Americans can be the change agents, continue to be the leaders in combating trafficking, slavery everywhere in the world, and starting right here in the Western Hemisphere with trafficking in Cuban medical professionals. So Carlos, thank you very much, and thank you to victims of communism and to the viewers today.
Thank you very much. And we have the Global Liberty Alliance, and they receive cases. They have been supporting different groups. They are very active and fulfilling the dream of some of us that we need to look for the people. We need to look for the people persecuted by the regime and try to find ways, innovative ways to prosecute these cases abroad. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, everyone, for watching our program today. I want to invite you to watch our program next week, and please continue the fight against this terrible regime, and also not against the doctors. We are looking for stopping the human trafficking and to protect the doctors from the exploitation from the regime. Thank you very much, and see you next week.